All right, guys, and I'm here to wrap up our lecture on the New Deal, the analysis of the New Deal, and we're going to jump right into things. Um, and we're gonna jump right to things from where we last left off by addressing Roosevelt's efforts to restore business confidence. Um, and at first, President Roosevelt, he did focus on restoring business confidence, and he really wanted to have businesses recover very strongly, and so he sought to provide something for everybody in the first 15 bills, the National Industrial Recovery Act. Within that act, there were provisions for labor to collectively bargain, and another for work relief through those are primary purposes of the bill were for business recovery. The main emphasis of the first New Deal was more new nationalists than anything else. And again, back to new nationalism, it was government planning in conjunction with big business. This was Theodore Roosevelt's plan back in the 1912 election. Has seen in the National Recovery Administration, which encouraged price fixing and the establishment of government-sponsored cartels. Now, the ensuing recovery was very limited because of the competing nature of the spending programs. The fiscal conservatism of the president and members of Congress really foiled the intended recovery. The Roosevelt administration had wanted to balance the federal budget. You have to remember that in 1932, Roosevelt's chief criticism of President Hoover was that he could not balance the budget. Throughout the 1920s, the federal government didn't really spend any money. The federal treasury was growing yearly because the federal government didn't have to rely on really tax money. They were able to sort of survive off of tariff income, really. So the budget was always quite balanced. There was never really any sort of worries about balancing the budget. With the crash, the government began to spend more, and they began to go into deficit spending. And the Roosevelt administration was very keen early on to avoid that, to avoid incurring any more debt. The early bills of the New Deal also have cost-cutting features in them, and these were all designed to cut federal spending while increasing revenues with a new tax on beer and wine. Now, there was no great increase in the federal government spending in the early years of Roosevelt's presidency. The relief efforts failed to generate full recovery because they failed to generate full employment. They also had cross purposes. The Agricultural Adjustment Act had been designed to reinvigorate agriculture and call for crops to be destroyed and raise the prices. But destroying the crops were really detrimental to many farm laborers, namely sharecroppers, black and white, across the Southeast. The failure of the first New Deal really wasn't that dismal to Roosevelt. It simply made him more willing to experiment with more pronounced measures, and we see these measures really begin to be expressed, really begin to take shape in 1935, 1936. So did the antagonisms with which its measures were met by big business, and to be certain, big business was supporting Herbert Hoover. They really didn't come into the 1930s with any sort of great a great love or respect for Franklin Roosevelt and his abilities or lack thereof. And this is really it's really kind of shocking, because when you really examine the New Deal, it's all business first. Business was almost uniformly appalled by the chaos and disorganization of the New Deal. Many attacked the New Deal, particularly in 1934. Many attacked it as being communist. The New Deal was generally seen as a threat to the managerial power and associated with a loss of status for business owners and business managers. At the same time, Roosevelt came under attack from the left. Demagogues, most notably Huey Long of Louisiana, threatened his bid of re-election. Roosevelt faced growing, excuse me, Roosevelt faced the growing militancy of farmers and newly industrialized union workers. And even congressional Democrats were putting pressure on Roosevelt for much more than he was willing to offer. And to add insult to injury, around this time, the two centerpieces of the first New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were struck down by the Supreme Court both of them in 1935. In 1935 and 1936, under these attacks, Roosevelt swung decisively to the left, and he sided with the big spenders and the Freedomites. The second New Deal, when you really look at the second New Deal, under the massive deficit spending and mass employment schemes, and all of these done in conjunction with work relief programs, raised the economy nearly to the pre-crash levels in 1929. These measures were much more radical, were really much less radical than they appear. They were more radical than the first New Deal, but they're really less radical than how they really appear. They appear they appear to help more Americans than they actually did. They helped far fewer Americans. And one such group was African Americans. Under pressure from Dixiecrats, the Social Security Act excluded farm laborers, domestic servants, and those working in establishments with less than 10 employees. This move left out most of the African American community in the southeastern United States. The new tax bills did not redistribute wealth, and part of the tax bills really just fell, were really just for show. For every dollar that was spent on unemployment relief effort and public works, another was spent on subsidizing banks and big business. It was also very clear that Roosevelt was not in favor of long-term relief. As stated earlier, he labeled long-term relief a narcotic that would destroy the national fiber. He also never called for an egalitarian society. We have to remember that Roosevelt, while willing to experiment, was a member of his class. He was a blue blood, a member of the New York State aristocracy. It had been said of Roosevelt that he adhered more to an aristocratic conservatism, with an emphasis on social responsibility, with respect to traditional forms of worship, respect for the limits of human knowledge, and a recognition and respect for human property and understanding. We can look at that and we can say that stability and not immobility was no, let me go back. And understanding that stability is not immobility, and it really serves as a sort of counter to traditional progressivism. Roosevelt, I should say, also never really accepted the Keynesian concept, and Keynesian is a reference to John Maynard Keynes. He never really accepted the concept of deficit spending. He saw all deficit spending as a temporary expedient to those three R's: relief, recovery, reform, while still wanting to balance that budget. After his re-election in 1936, he declared the Depression over prematurely, and he decided to rebalance the budget by cutting government spending, particularly in the Public Works Administration, and the new Social Security tax removed potential spending money as well. The benefits would not really begin until 1940. And of course, the Federal Reserve, fearing inflation, contracted the money supply. This resulted in a major recession that wiped out the gains of the New Deal. Industrial production dropped, wages dropped, national income fell, unemployment increased. And of course, when examining Roosevelt, we also have to look at that court packing scheme. His attempt to pack the courts led to a cry of dictatorship and really broke his control over Congress. In effect, it ended the New Deal after a final round of legislation in 1938. After that, the New Deal ends. The New Deal, the first and the New Deal, the first and the second New Deals are really just between 1933 and 1938. After that, Roosevelt really couldn't generate congressional support, and this is all harkens back to that court packing scheme. Economic recovery did not occur until 1941, not until the outbreak of World War II, as far as the United States was concerned. The New Deal, what the New Deal did do was the New Deal, what the New Deal did do was it did, it didn't try to establish socialism or even really desire to, nor did it really accept or really plan to institute massive deficit spending. All of that happened under World War II. Well, what it didn't do was it didn't attempt to redistribute the wealth. It simply attempted to solve the economic woes. And it didn't even do that. Again, World War II did that. The New Deal, in essence, was a very conservative attempt to stem the flood. Essentially, it didn't really appear conservative at the time. It appeared to be the most liberal action of American history, and in many ways you can look at it like that. Social Security was definitely a very liberal action, but the New Deal itself wasn't that liberal. The emphasis on business support harkens back to tried and true American methods of doing all that the federal government and Congress could to support American business. It just so happened that these measures fell short of the intended purpose, but they had this major unintended purpose, and that major unintended purpose was to radically shift the impetus and the thought on political and social aspects of life within the Republic. The outcome of that was both positive and negative, and the New Deal started this new thinking on the role, the responsibilities, and the duties of the Republic. It did very early on stop the downward spiral in 1933, 1934, and it achieved some recovery twice. Back in 1934 and then between 1935 and 1936. And it was because of that recovery between 1935 and 1936 that Roosevelt won so handedly over Alf Landon of Kansas. But really, all of that recovery was wiped out in the recession of 37-38 that was prompted by Roosevelt's premature announcement that the Depression was over. It may well have the New Deal may well have prevented the complete and total collapse of the capitalist economic system and democracy in the United States, while fascism and dictatorship rose elsewhere, particularly in Nazi Germany and fascist Spain, Spain under Franco. Now, the New Deal, via the experimentation in solutions, created a new role and function for the government and people's lives, as I stated earlier. The economy remained capitalist and in private hands, but the government did and does still exert a regulatory control, has a major safety mechanism against a future Great Depression. The New Deal also created a safety net for those within the capitalist system. The most revolutionary aspect of the New Deal, and the only coherent and continual theme within these legislation programs. The legacy of the New Deal can be seen as reform. Had the federal government was massively expanded and the power of the presidency increased dramatically. And of course, this power shift was also accompanied by a very real shift away from Wall Street to Washington. Has Washington took a more direct role in the economic future of the republic. During the New Deal, Roosevelt was the republic's chief financial engineer. He was the guy coming up with all the programs for spending money, for generating money, for directing the path of the nation's economy. That was another quite revolutionary prospect. I think that the last time someone in Washington did that was maybe Alexander Hamilton and Hamilton's economic schemes. The drawbacks, of course, of this arrangement was that everything was going to be hodgepodge. The New Deal was a very hodgepodge assemblage of economic planning without any real coherency, and really that growth in executive power was going to prove to be quite dangerous to the constitutional system of checks and balances. Now, the New Deal also brought groups that have been left out of the national economy and cultural life back into the fold. Pro-union sentiments of the New Deal helped to create the largest middle class in United States history, and the gains of labor were more than just financial. The typical 5-day week, paid vacations, sabbaticals, and the 40 hours a week work cycle were all developed and implemented during the New Deal. The New Deal's impact on agriculture was more mixed, had the emphasis on raising prices and destroying crops, had a terrible effect on sharecroppers, and did not really succeed in raising prices. The New Deal measures and increased mechanization led to consolidation in agriculture and the development of agro-business. And really, African Americans on a whole, aside from just sharecropping, they were helped and hurt by many of the New Deal measures. Agricultural policies led to widespread evictions for African American sharecroppers. Measures for organized labor helped those in industrial centers. Roosevelt, though, refused to support civil rights or anti-lynching legislation because, again, he was dependent upon Dixiecrats' votes for support for his New Deal program. The rise of a new generation of African American leaders set the tone for a new civil rights movement. And that movement would emerge in the years directly following World War II. Women also made great strides during this time. Frances Perkins became the first woman appointed to a cabinet position, becoming Secretary of Labor. And of course, you really can't speak of President Franklin Roosevelt without making at least one reference to the extraordinary career of Eleanor Roosevelt. And I mean, among her many accomplishments was the redefinition of the role of First Lady. We never had such an activist First Lady. I don't think we've had a greater First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt. The New Deal also reinforced societal constraints on women, and it really echoed long-held stereotypes, namely that a woman in the workforce was taking a job away from a man. The New Deal also created the concept of government patronage of the arts. the politics of the New Deal made the Democratic Party the dominant party, creating a coalition that would dominate American politics until the civil rights of the 1960s. In a nutshell, the New Deal gave us the American political and social system that we live with and really argue about today. And with that being said, we'll break here. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another fast fact. Not a fast fact, another lecture. Sorry about that. It's another lecture I'll see you guys for.